Sir, we need you to step outside.
I am outside. That's my friend. What is it about?
We received a call about a disturbance at this address. We're going to need you to step off the porch, sir.
I'm not stepping anywhere. Can you tell me who called?
Sir, hands where I can see them. Sir, I won't ask again.
He had survived Korea. He had buried his wife of 44 years. He had raised 3 children in that house, painted every wall, fixed every pipe, planted every rose bush in that front yard with his own 2 hands. And on a Tuesday morning in March, at 6:17 a.m., while the coffee was still brewing and the house still smelled like sleep, someone knocked on his door. Not knocked, pounded. The kind of knock that doesn't ask. The kind that tells you something is already wrong before you even reach the handle. His name was Walter James Holloway, 76 years old, retired postal worker, grandfather of 5, deacon at Shiloh Baptist Church for the last 22 years. And when he opened that door in his pajamas, coffee mug in hand, he had no idea that the next 40 minutes would change his life, and that the entire country would eventually watch every second of it on a 2-inch Bodycam screen. Stay with me, because this story is not just about what happened to Walter. It is about what happens to all of us when the system gets it wrong. It is about what a family refused to accept. It is about a courtroom that finally had to answer a question America has been avoiding for generations. And it is about what every single person watching this needs to know before they ever open their front door to a badge and a uniform again. Walter James Holloway had lived at 4814 Delwood Drive in Charlotte, North Carolina for 31 years. He bought that house in 1993, paid every mortgage payment on time, never missed a single one. He used to joke that the house was more his than the bank's the day he made that final payment in 2021. He framed the payoff letter, hung it in the hallway right next to his children's graduation photos and a portrait of Eleanor in her Sunday best that had been taken the year before she got sick. His oldest son, Darius, was visiting that weekend, drove down from Richmond on Friday evening with his sister Camille, who had flown in from Atlanta. It was supposed to be a quiet family weekend. Walter's birthday was the following Thursday. They had planned a small dinner, just the family, a cake, some of Walter's favorite Marvin Gaye playing low in the background the way he liked it. Friday night, they had laughed until their stomachs hurt going through old home videos on Darius's laptop. Saturday, they had gone through photo albums. Eleanor young and radiant in photographs from the 70s. Walter in his postal uniform on his first day of work. Darius and Camille as gap-toothed children on Christmas morning. And Sunday morning, March 10th, Camille had woken up early to make her father's coffee before he came downstairs. Walter came down at 6:10 a.m. in his pajamas, the navy blue set his late wife Eleanor had given him 3 Christmases before she passed. He took the mug from Camille's hand, smiled, squeezed her shoulder the way he always did, and walked toward the front window to check on his rose bushes the way he did every single morning without fail. That is when he saw the patrol cars. 2 of them, parked at angles in his driveway. Lights off, but engines running. A 3rd unit was parked at the curb. He set his mug on the hallway table, then picked it back up because his hands needed something to hold. He opened the door before they knocked. And, standing on his porch, on the porch he had pressure washed just 4 days earlier, were 2 officers in full tactical gear. A 3rd was already moving around the side of the house toward the backyard. The male officer spoke first. His voice was flat, practiced, the kind of tone that has stopped caring whether it sounds human. "Sir, we need you to step outside." Walter looked at him, then looked past him at the patrol cars, then back. "I am outside," he said quietly. "This is my front door. What is this about?" "We received a call about a disturbance at this address." Walter stood very still. Behind him, Darius had appeared in the hallway. Camille was at the top of the stairs. Neither of them said anything yet. They had both gone cold in the way that black families in America go cold when they see uniforms at the door, a silence that is not confusion but calculation, a stillness that is not passivity but survival instinct refined across generations. "A disturbance?" Walter said. "I was having my morning coffee. My children are visiting for the weekend." The officer did not look at Darius, did not acknowledge Camille. His eyes stayed on Walter with the kind of focus that had already made a decision and was now just waiting for confirmation. "We're going to need you to step off the porch, sir." And here is where Walter James Holloway did something that took more courage than most people will ever understand. He did not move, not out of defiance, not out of anger. He stood his ground the way a man stands on something he has earned, with the quiet, unshakable certainty of someone who knows exactly where he is and exactly who he is and is not willing to pretend otherwise for anyone. "I'm not stepping anywhere," he said. "Can you tell me who called?" "What disturbance?" Darius stepped forward. His voice was careful, measured. He had been in enough rooms in his life to know that careful and measured were armor. Officer, he's 76 years old. He just woke up. This is his home. Can you tell us what's actually happening here? The female officer shifted. Her hand moved toward her belt. Not reaching, just resting. But everyone on that porch felt it. Sir, hands where I can see them, the male officer said, looking directly at Walter. Walter slowly raised his left hand. Palm open, fingers spread. His right hand held the coffee mug steady at his side because putting it down felt like surrender, and Walter James Holloway had not survived everything he had survived to surrender on his own front porch on a Sunday morning in March. I'm showing you my hands, he said. I am an old man in my pajamas. I have done nothing wrong. The male officer took one step forward, and Darius Holloway stepped fully in front of his father. Not aggressively, not with raised fists or raised voice. He simply placed his body between the officer and his 76-year-old father the way a son does when something ancient and protective takes over every rational thought in his mind. You need to tell us why you are here, Darius said. Right now. Because this man is my father, and this is his house, and we are not moving until you explain what is happening. There was a silence on that porch that lasted only 4 seconds but felt like 4 years. And then the male officer said something that made Camille, watching from the top of the stairs, press her hand over her mouth. We had a report that this residence was being burglarized. Walter Holloway blinked. He looked at the officer, then at the patrol cars in his driveway, then back at the officer. Burglarized, he repeated. Yes, sir. Someone called and said my house was being broken into. That is correct. Walter was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was so steady and so calm that Darius would later say it was the most frightening thing he had ever heard. Not because it was angry, but because it carried the weight of a man who had lived long enough to not be surprised. Officer, Walter said slowly, I have lived in this house for 31 years. My name is on the deed. My car is in the driveway. My children drove here from Richmond and Atlanta to celebrate my birthday. And someone called you and told you this house was being broken into. He paused. Who called? The officer hesitated. We are not able to disclose that at this time. Was it my neighbor? Walter asked. The one who moved in 8 months ago? The one who has never once introduced himself? Another silence. Camille came downstairs. She stood beside her brother. The three of them, Walter, Darius, and Camille Holloway, stood on that porch in a line, and the image that the Bodycam captured in that moment would later be shared over 4 million times across social media. An old man in his pajamas, his 2 adult children beside him, 3 officers on his property at 6 in the morning, and a coffee mug that never once spilled. Not through any of it. Not even when Walter's hands were shaking in a way he would not admit until months later in an interview when he finally let himself cry on camera for the first time. The officers eventually confirmed the address, ran the name, verified the deed. One of them, the female officer, had the decency to look uncomfortable. She took a small step back. Her posture changed. Something in her face shifted in the way that happens when a person realizes they are not in the middle of a crime scene, but in the middle of a mistake. A mistake that had put 3 officers with tactical gear on the porch of a 76-year-old man before 7 in the morning on a Sunday. A mistake that had made Darius Holloway step in front of his father's body, because in that half-awake, terrified moment his brain had not been able to think of anything else to do. A mistake that had made Camille Holloway stand at the top of the stairs for 11 minutes, calculating exits and outcomes in the way that should never be necessary in your father's house on a quiet Sunday morning. The male officer cleared his throat. Mr. Holloway, we apologize for the inconvenience. It appears this was a misunderstanding. Walter looked at him for a long time. A misunderstanding, he said. Yes, sir. Walter nodded slowly, the way men nod when they have heard something so insufficient that words would only make it worse. He stepped back inside his house. Darius and Camille followed. The door closed. The officers left, and Walter James Holloway sat down at his kitchen table, set his coffee mug in front of him, and did not speak for 23 minutes. Camille sat across from him. Darius stood by the window. Nobody turned on the television. Nobody checked their phone. The house that had been full of laughter 48 hours earlier sat in a silence that had a different texture now. Heavier. Older. It was Camille who finally spoke. Dad, she said softly. We need to call someone. Walter looked up. I know, he said. They called attorney Renee Sutton of the Sutton Civil Rights Law Group in Charlotte that same afternoon. She had handled 14 cases of racial profiling in Mecklenburg County in the previous 3 years. When Darius described what had happened, she did not express surprise. She expressed something quieter and more devastating than surprise. She expressed recognition. Attorney Sutton met with the family the following Tuesday at her office on South Tryon Street. She sat across from Walter and listened to the entire account without interrupting. When he finished, she opened a legal pad and wrote 3 words at the top of the page. She turned it around so the family could read it. It said, "We have everything." The Bodycam footage was requested under a public records filing 4 days after the incident. The city initially indicated a 30-day processing timeline. Attorney Sutton filed an emergency motion citing the clear public interest nature of the incident and the age and vulnerability of the affected party. The footage was released in 11 days. It took 6 hours after release for the clip to reach 1 million views. By the end of that first week, it had been covered by every major news network in the country. Legal analysts dissected the footage frame by frame. Civil rights organizations issued statements. The Charlotte Police Department announced an internal review. The mayor's office released a carefully worded statement expressing concern and promising transparency. Attorney Sutton held a press conference on the steps of the Mecklenburg County Courthouse exactly 3 weeks after the incident. Walter stood beside her in a dark suit and the tie Eleanor had given him for their 30th anniversary. Darius and Camille stood on his other side. Attorney Sutton spoke for 11 minutes about the legal framework of racially motivated emergency calls, about the documented pattern of similar incidents in that specific zip code over the previous 4 years, and about the civil suit being filed that morning against the city of Charlotte, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, and the 3 responding officers individually for unlawful intimidation, violation of Walter Holloway's Fourth Amendment rights, and deliberate failure to escalate a situation that presented absolutely zero threat indicators. Then she stepped aside, and Walter approached the microphone. He stood there for a moment without speaking, looking out at the cameras and the reporters and the people who had gathered on the courthouse steps. Many of them elderly, many of them holding handwritten signs, many of them already crying before he even said a word. He cleared his throat. "I fought for this country," he said. "I came home and I built a life. I bought a house, and I raised children, and I paid my taxes, and I served my church, and I buried my wife. And on a Sunday morning in March, a man who does not know my name looked at my driveway and decided that I did not belong there." He paused. "I want you to understand something. I was not afraid of those officers. I was tired. There is a difference. Fear is something that passes. Tired is something that accumulates. And I am 76 years old, and I am tired in a way that I do not have enough years left to recover from." The courthouse steps went completely silent. "But I'm standing here," Walter said, "and I will keep standing here, because if I sit down, my grandchildren will have to stand up in my place. And they are too young. They deserve better than what I got on that porch. They deserve a country that sees them before it fears them." He stepped back from the microphone. The civil suit was formally filed the same morning as the press conference. The case was docketed as Holloway versus City of Charlotte et al. In the United States District Court for the Western District of North Carolina. It named 4 defendants: the city itself, the police department as an institutional body, Officer Craig Demeter, who had been the primary speaking officer on the porch, and Officer Sandra Voss, who had been the female officer present. The 3rd officer who had circled the house was identified as Officer Paul Renfrew and added as a defendant 2 weeks into the discovery process. The suit alleged 5 distinct legal violations. The first was an unreasonable search and seizure under the Fourth Amendment. Specifically, the warrantless approach and de facto detention of Walter Holloway on his own property without probable cause. The second was a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, alleging that the officer's response was materially influenced by the race of the individuals they encountered. The third was intentional infliction of emotional distress, documented through medical records showing Walter had been treated for elevated blood pressure and anxiety in the 2 weeks following the incident. The fourth was failure to properly verify emergency call legitimacy before deployment, a direct procedural violation of CMPD's own internal protocols, which required officers responding to burglary calls to cross-reference property ownership records before making contact. The fifth was municipal liability under what is known in civil rights law as Monell Doctrine, the legal principle that a city can be held responsible for constitutional violations that result from institutional policies, customs, or deliberate indifference to known patterns of misconduct. That fifth claim was the most significant, and it was the one that made the city's legal team the most nervous, because Attorney Sutton had done her homework. In her discovery filings, she submitted documentation of 11 similar incidents in Mecklenburg County over the preceding 4 years. 11 cases in which black homeowners, 9 of them over the age of 55, have been subjected to aggressive police responses triggered by 911 calls from neighbors who turn out to have no factual basis for their reports. In 9 of those 11 cases, the caller was later identified as a white resident who had moved into the neighborhood within the previous 18 months. In 7 of those 9 cases, no disciplinary action of any kind had been taken against either the caller or the responding officers. The pattern was not subtle. The defense filed an initial motion to dismiss on grounds of qualified immunity, the legal doctrine that protects police officers from civil liability unless they have violated a clearly established constitutional right. It is the same doctrine that has shielded officers in thousands of civil rights cases across the country. Attorney Sutton had anticipated this motion. She had spent 3 weeks preparing her response before the defense even filed it. Her opposition brief was 47 pages. It argued that qualified immunity could not apply in this case because the Fourth Amendment right to be free from warrantless detention on one's own property had been clearly established in federal case law for decades. She cited 11 controlling precedents. She cited the CMPD's own written protocols. And she submitted an expert declaration from a retired federal judge who had spent 22 years on the bench and had never, in his own words, seen a more straightforward case of constitutional overreach in a residential context. The motion to dismiss was denied. The case proceeded to discovery. What came out of discovery was more damaging than even Attorney Sutton had anticipated. Officer Craig Demeter, the primary officer on the porch that morning, had 2 prior complaints in his personnel file. The first was from 3 years earlier. A black homeowner in the Berwick neighborhood who had filed a complaint alleging that Demeter had refused to acknowledge his ownership of a vehicle during a traffic stop and had detained him for 38 minutes without cause. That complaint had been reviewed internally and closed with a notation of insufficient evidence. The second complaint was from 18 months before the Holloway incident. A Latino family in Steel Creek who alleged that Demeter had entered their backyard without a warrant following a neighbor's noise complaint and had refused to leave when asked. That complaint had also been closed internally. No disciplinary action in either case. During his deposition, Officer Demeter was asked directly why he had not verified property ownership records before approaching the Holloway residence. His answer, given under oath, was that the volume of calls that morning had not allowed time for standard verification procedures. Attorney Sutton asked him how long a property ownership verification typically takes in the CMPD system. He said approximately 90 seconds. She asked him how long officers had sat in the driveway of 4814 Delwood Drive before approaching the door. After a pause, he said approximately 4 minutes. She did not respond. She simply wrote something on her legal pad and moved to her next question. Everyone in that deposition room understood what had just happened. Officer Sandra Voss told a different story in her deposition. She was visibly uncomfortable throughout. When asked whether she had believed at any point during the encounter that Walter Holloway posed a threat, she hesitated for a long time before answering. Her answer was no. When asked whether she had considered intervening when Officer Demeter ordered Walter to step off his own porch, she said she had not felt it was her place to contradict a senior officer in the field. When asked whether she believed the encounter had been handled appropriately, she paused again. She said she believed mistakes had been made. It was the most consequential sentence spoken in any deposition connected to the case. Officer Paul Renfrew, who had circled the house, invoked his right to have departmental counsel present for his deposition and answered the majority of questions with variations of "I do not recall" or "I was following standard procedure." His deposition produced nothing useful for either side and will be remembered primarily for a moment near the end when Attorney Sutton asked him whether he had found anything suspicious when he circled the property. He said no. She asked him what he had found. He said a garden and some rose bushes. She asked him whether rose bushes were consistent with a residence being actively burglarized. Defense counsel objected. The objection was noted. The trial began on a Monday in September, 14 months after the incident. The federal courtroom in Charlotte was standing room only on the first day. Walter sat at the plaintiff's table in the same dark suit he had worn to the press conference. Elan Orestilla, Darius on his left, Camille on his right. The defense opened by arguing that the officers had acted in good faith on the information available to them, and that their response had been consistent with department protocol. They argued that the encounter had been brief, that no physical harm had occurred, and that the emotional distress claims were speculative and unsupported by clinical evidence sufficient to meet the legal threshold. Attorney Sutton opened by playing the Bodycam footage on a screen large enough for the entire courtroom to see. She played it without commentary. She let it run for 4 minutes and 12 seconds in complete silence. And then she turned to the jury and said 7 words. He was home. They had no reason. She sat down. It took the jury 3 days of deliberation. On the 4th morning, they returned to the courtroom, and the forewoman, a retired schoolteacher from Concord, stood and read the verdict in a voice that did not waver. Liable on all 5 counts. The courtroom did not erupt. It did something more powerful than erupt. It exhaled, a sound that was not celebration, but release, the sound of people who had been holding something heavy for a very long time, finally being allowed to set it down. The damages awarded totaled $1.4 million. $800,000 in compensatory damages covering medical costs, emotional distress, and the documented impact on Walter's quality of life. $600,000 in punitive damages assessed, specifically against Officer Craig Demeter and the City of Charlotte for the pattern of institutional indifference evidenced in discovery. But the financial award was not the most consequential outcome of Holloway versus City of Charlotte. The most consequential outcome was what happened afterward. The court issued a set of injunctive remedies, mandatory institutional changes that the CMPD was required to implement as a condition of the judgment. The first was a new protocol requiring officers responding to any residential disturbance or burglary call to verify property ownership records before making contact with any person at the address. 90 seconds, the thing that could have prevented everything. Now mandatory. The second was a mandatory de-escalation training module specifically addressing encounters with elderly residents. A module to be completed by every active officer within 6 months and incorporated into all future academy training. The third was the establishment of an independent civilian review board with actual subpoena power. Not an advisory committee with no authority, but a genuine oversight body capable of compelling testimony and recommending binding discipline. It was the third remedy that drew the most attention nationally, because independent civilian oversight with real authority is something police departments across the country have resisted for decades. The Holloway case cracked that door open in Charlotte in a way that years of advocacy had not been able to. Officer Craig Demeter was suspended without pay for 45 days following the verdict. The suspension was the maximum allowed under the terms of the police union contract. He was subsequently reassigned from field patrol to an administrative position and required to complete additional training as a condition of any future return to active duty. As of the time of this video, he remains in that administrative role. Officer Sandra Voss was not suspended. The court had noted her deposition testimony acknowledging that mistakes had been made and her posture during the encounter as mitigating factors. She was required to complete the de-escalation training and was issued a formal letter of reprimand that was placed in her permanent personnel file. Sources close to the department indicated that she had voluntarily requested a transfer to community outreach following the conclusion of the case. Officer Paul Renfrew received the lightest official consequence, a written reprimand and mandatory training. His union filed a grievance against even that consequence, arguing that circling a property during a burglary call was standard procedure and could not reasonably be the basis for any disciplinary action. The grievance was denied. The neighbor who had made the 911 call, identified publicly during the trial as Thomas Greer, 43, a software consultant who had purchased the house 3 doors down 8 months before the incident, was not criminally charged. Prosecutors reviewed the case and determined that proving deliberate racial motivation in the filing of a 911 call met a standard of criminal intent that the existing evidence could not sustain beyond a reasonable doubt. Greer gave a written statement through his attorney expressing deep remorse and indicating that he had not intended to cause harm. Walter Holloway did not comment on Thomas Greer publicly. Not once. Not at the press conference. Not at the courthouse steps after the verdict. Not in any of the interviews he gave in the months that followed. When a reporter finally pressed him directly, asked him what he wanted people to know about the man who had made the call, Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said this: "I don't need him to suffer. I need him to understand. Those are 2 different things. Suffering ends. Understanding lasts." Those 2 sentences were printed on the front page of the Charlotte Observer the following morning. Walter James Holloway still lives at 4814 Delwood Drive. His rose bushes are blooming. He still checks on them every morning with his coffee mug in hand. His granddaughter, the oldest one, 14 years old now, sharp as glass and twice as clear, asked him recently whether he was glad he had fought the case, whether it had been worth it. whether anything had actually changed. Walter thought about the question for a long time. He thought about the 90 seconds. The property ownership verification that takes 90 seconds and is now mandatory. He thought about the officers sitting in his driveway for 4 full minutes and choosing not to spend 90 of those seconds on a check that would have told them everything they needed to know. He thought about Eleanor's tie and the courthouse steps and the forewoman's voice and the sound the courtroom made when she finished reading. He thought about the 11 families before him who had gone through the same thing and gotten nothing. No futi, no attorney, no verdict, no remedios. Just the silence of a system that had looked at what happened to them and decided it was not worth the paperwork. Yes, he told his granddaughter, it was worth it. Not because it fixed everything, but because now there is a record. Now it is written down somewhere official that what happened to me was wrong. And that record belongs to you. It belongs to your children. Nobody can take that back. His granddaughter nodded. Then she asked him if she could have some of his coffee. He laughed. The first real laugh, deep and full and unguarded, that Camille, sitting at the kitchen table pretending to read a magazine, had heard from her father in a very long time. He handed her the mug. Now, before this video ends, there are things you need to know. Things that Walter's case teaches every single one of us regardless of our race, our age, or where we live. The first thing is this. You have the right to remain in your home. If police come to your door without a warrant, you are not required to step outside. You are not required to answer questions. You can speak to them through a closed or partially open door. Opening your door is not consent to enter, and it is not an invitation to detain you. Know this. Remember this. Teach it to your parents and your children. The second thing is this. Document everything immediately. If you have a doorbell camera, check the footage before you do anything else. Write down every word you can remember. Note the time, the badge numbers if you can see them, the number of officers, the patrol car numbers. Do this while it is fresh. Do this before you call anyone. The documentation you create in the first hour after an encounter is often the most valuable evidence in any subsequent legal action. The third thing is this. Request the bodycam footage as soon as possible. In most jurisdictions, this is a public record and you're entitled to it. Do not wait. Departments have retention schedules and footage can be deleted after a certain period if no formal request is on file. File the request in writing. Keep a copy. The fourth thing is this. Contact a civil rights attorney before you decide whether to pursue action. Many civil rights attorneys work on contingency in cases like Walter's, meaning they do not collect fees unless they win. The conversation costs you nothing and the information it gives you is invaluable. Organizations like the ACLU, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and local civil rights law groups can provide referrals if you do not know where to start. The fifth and most important thing is this. What happened to Walter James Holloway was not an isolated incident. It was one documented moment in a pattern that has been repeating in this country for generations. The way to break that pattern is not silence. It is not acceptance. It is not the exhausted resignation of people who have been told too many times that the system will not hear them. The way to break it is exactly what Walter did. Stand in your doorway. Hold your ground. Tell your story. And do not stop until someone writes it down somewhere official and calls it what it is. Because the record matters. The record is what separates the incidents that change something from the incidents that disappear. Walter James Holloway made sure his incident did not disappear. And on a quiet morning in Charlotte, with his coffee in hand and his rose bushes blooming and his granddaughter sitting at his kitchen table, that record, his record, is still standing. Just like him.